The debate over taxes on home heating was front and center in the House again today.
All 10 premiers, Conservative, Liberal, and NDP, are calling for him to take the tax off so Canadians will keep the heat on.
We put forward a plan to help Canadians with their home heating bill, but climate delay Liberals and climate deny Conservatives will back the profits of big oil again.
It was with confusion and consternation that I noted the way the NDP voted with the Conservatives against one of the most successful measures Canada has ever seen in the fight against climate change.
It's almost tragic and heartbreaking to see these two squabbling in this way.
This time, MPs soundly defeated a non-binding NDP motion calling on the government to remove the GST from all forms of home heating, make eco-energy retrofits and heat pumps free for low-income and middle-class Canadians, and to pay for those provisions with by taxing excess profits on big oil and gas corporations. How will the politics around the climate versus affordability debate play out? It's time to bring in the power panel. Amanda Alvaro is a political commentator. And here with me, Jordan Leichnitz is the Canadian Program Manager for the Frederick Ebert Foundation. Tim Powers is the Chair of Summa Strategies. And Shachi Kurl is the President of the Angus Reid Institute. So, Jordan, I'm going to start with you. You heard the Prime Minister's point there that maybe the NDP's position on climate has become difficult to decipher, that there might not be a lot of consistency to it, because one day they're saying they're going to back the Conservative motion to lift the carbon tax on home heating. The next day, they're saying they're climate warriors. Do you think that they've kind of backed themselves into a corner here? Like, what does the NDP believe when it comes to climate? It's hard to say.
Well, I think the only confusion and consternation that's happened around climate over the last couple of weeks has come from the Prime Minister's decision here. And, you know, the NDP put forward something I think that was very clear in terms of their commitment to achieving emissions reductions, which, by the way, would be more than the Liberals have managed to do with their plan, but they're not going to do it on the backs of consumers. And this has actually been something that's pretty consistent for the NDP. You know, I remember reaching back to like 2008, you know, Jack Layton was out there talking about removing the GST off home heating. So that's not a new ask for them. And I think it makes sense in this context because there's a lot more regional fairness to it when you compare it to what the Liberals have put forward, because that's going to benefit every Canadian. And we know that home heating is not a luxury. This is something people have to do. And so if we want to give people a break as folks are struggling to make ends meet, I think this is a pretty sensible way to go about it. And I don't think it takes anything away from their commitment on climate issues.
Amanda, is the carbon tax dead? Because we've seen these carve-outs. There's another carve-out potentially coming in the Senate. And yet we still see the government's record on climate change and reducing emissions isn't all that great. I mean, is there something to be said for the carbon tax, or should we just kiss it goodbye and think of something else to fight climate change?
Well, wouldn't that be easy if we just scrapped everything that the Conservatives say we should scrap? But, you know, it was interesting. We started talking about this last week, Poilievre's framing of it becoming a carbon tax election, the next election being a carbon tax election. You have to wonder if this really could be the ballot box issue. And framing is everything. And certainly at a time when Canadians are feeling the crunch more than ever, and then it's a cooler time of year and those temperatures are continuing to drop and people are thinking about heating their homes, it's very easy to make that affordability versus sustainability argument. Can you make that roll all the way to the next election? I don't know. I don't think so. This was a cornerstone of the election platform for the Liberals. It's something that Canadians voted on. It's something that Canadians feel strongly about. It is a rebate system. And I think that, unfortunately, the Liberals have had a hard time on the communications of this file because it's certainly about emissions reduction and looking at climate change, but it's also about affordability. This is about putting dollars back into Canadians' pockets while at the same time dealing with this very real crisis that's in front of us. But the plot is being lost a little bit, certainly in the affordability argument. And like I said last week, I think that the Conservatives have done a better job of changing the frame on this one.
Shachi, it's funny Amanda says it's messaging. I was listening to the U.S. election coverage last night, and they were interviewing a Republican presidential candidate, and he was asked about the abortion defeats because everything that was on the ballot related to abortion went down to defeat last night. And he said the same thing that she's saying. Well, it's not about abortion. It's really about how we've sold it. It's about the messaging, that we haven't really communicated well what conservatives want to do on abortion. What are you hearing from people when you poll them? Do people generally support a carbon tax? Are they confused about what the tax is? Do they just need to hear it better from the lips of the Prime Minister? Like, where do they stand on this program?
So many things. So, first of all, in terms of the base that traditionally votes either for this government or for the NDP, which makes up enough for that confidence and supply agreement, plus bloc voters, they are generally, yes, supportive of, in favor of, willing to pay for carbon pricing. And it has been that way for a long time. Now, how much, in what context, and certainly against the backdrop of a cost of living crisis, we've seen, going back to 2017, 2018, 2019, climate change being the top and driving issue in terms of what do you care most about in this country today? What's the issue that's got the most resonance for you? It's dropped all the way. We haven't seen it anywhere in the top 3 since the pandemic. And so when you get to that tension point, what is in my wallet versus what is perceived to be in the government's wallet in the name of climate change or change behavior, with the amount of confusion over what people think they are getting or don't know that they're getting or don't know that they're eligible for around a rebate. You know, if 80% of Canadians were actually aware that they are eligible for that rebate, then this would perhaps not have blown up the way it is. So this is a communications issue, absolutely, on part of this government. But look, it's also an economy, a household economy. What can I afford versus what is my goal issue? And it's also one that really speaks to now the door that the Liberals have opened up around regional disparity. So Atlantic Canada gets a carve-out. Where's my carve-out in this part of the province or that part of the province? And you know, Tim knows when I talk about this, we haven't had a juicy regional fight on regional politics in a while. So
bring it on.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it had slipped that far down the list of priorities.
Like, it's not out of the top 10, but it's not in the top 3.
Yeah, I mean, what a change, really. In 2019 election, it was probably close to the top, right? That's when the Green Party had, you know, probably their best vote share. Well, I don't know. I want to say they won't get any better than that, but they certainly performed very well in that election because climate was so front and center. And that brings me to you, dear Tim Powers.
Well, you look very good tonight, young David Cochran, so thank you.
Okay.
I don't know where to look. I feel very awkward.
Okay, well, I mean, I think, you know, Poilievre's got a victory on this one, right? I mean, because he introduced this motion last week, it certainly stirred up a lot of conversation about the carbon tax. And then Goody Hutchings obviously didn't help things by saying, oh, if you voted Liberal, you might get a better deal. But is it not incumbent on Poilievre at some point to come out with some sort of climate plan? Like, can he just criticize the government and say, oh, you're all wrong about this? Does he not have to at some point say, this is what we will do beyond just the sloganeering, beyond just saying technology, not taxes?
Now, if I wanted to give you a good conservative answer to this, I'd do the Ken McDonald and maybe go like that, but I won't do that because that wasn't appropriate in Parliament, not appropriate here now. I think, look, the good opposition politics for Poilievre right now, JP, is to not interrupt his political enemy while that enemy is in the process of making multiple mistakes. Absolutely, at some point in time, Pierre Poilievre is going to have to speak to, the Conservatives are going to have to speak to climate policy, but that time isn't now. And arguably there's a little back and forth in Parliament, but that's getting a little bit silly. I tell you what was the most interesting thing there today, and it's the thing I'm watching most around all of this, is what is Stephen Guilbeault going to do? In the clip you played, as the Prime Minister was challenging Pierre Poilievre on his bona fides, Mr. Guilbeault didn't look very happy. In his comments on Monday, I think it was after the vote, it was pretty clear in that he's at a line when he said, if I am still Environment Minister, I'm paraphrasing, but it was something to that effect, there will be no more carve-outs. Yeah. The Prime Minister arguably right now has the most at risk here. And so why would Poilievre give him ammunition in coming forward with a plan right now as Trudeau is struggling a little bit with his credibility and bona fides on climate among many of his key supporting groups?
Jordan, do you think, I asked Amanda earlier if the carbon tax is dead, you know, do you think that it's headed like, do you think we're going to scrap this thing? Because we've had the carve out now for Atlantic Canada predominantly, but all people across the country use home heating oil as well, of course. We have before the Senate now this bill to make exceptions for farmers so that they do not have to pay the carbon tax on fuel they use to dry their grain, for example, and heat their barns. That's a substantial source of emissions in this country. You know, at this point, it seems like everybody is going to try and get the carbon tax, you know, knocked off for their little pet project, right? It could be headed in that direction. Do you see that playing out? Like, what is the future of the carbon tax?
Sure. I think it's a risk, but I also think we have to be careful to overstate, you know, or not to overstate what's happening. So there's obviously the consumer side carbon price, which is primarily what we're talking about here, but then there's also an industrial carbon price that covers a large amount of emissions in Canada, and that has remained really relatively untouched. There are other issues with it. There are carve-outs that have been given that are problematic and you know, should be changed by the Liberal government, but really, when we're talking about the consumer carbon price, I think we have to understand that it still applies a lot of places, and the one that people will most commonly know of course, is gasoline, right? And no one's really seriously talking about removing that, except of course, the Conservative leader. But what the problem that the Prime Minister has is a political one here. He's stuck between his Environment Minister and his Atlantic Caucus, and he's admitted, he's given away he's conceded the argument that this tax is an affordability issue for people. And so once you do that, it's like pulling at a thread. And this is going to unravel further. And I think there's no question about that. Now, can you contain it to limits on home heating? Maybe. If you take some quick action and kind of put some guardrails around that, you might be able to do that, make a regional equity argument. But really the thing that if we want to be serious about tackling emissions, it also means investments in changing how people heat their homes and how energy efficient their homes are. And I think what this whole discussion has also revealed is that we have major gaps in the programs that exist for that today. Most low-income people can't access them, and even those who do have the money are having trouble qualifying. So we have to do better on that.
Amanda, I think a lot of people at home would understand why the government is pursuing this policy of putting a pause on the carbon tax for home heating oil. It is 2 to 4 times more expensive. Why does, you know, a senior in Bonavista, Newfoundland and Labrador, have to pay exorbitant prices when there's no alternative to home heating oil? Like, is she really going to have that big of an impact on climate change and emissions in the country's trajectory? No, probably not. But what people don't get necessarily is the political angle of this. They get the policy approach, but they don't understand maybe how the government decided that it was okay to do this and really benefit predominantly one part of the country and not foresee there being criticism from other energy consumers. How did the government not anticipate this?
Well, and again, I sound a bit like a broken record, but I think part of this was more of a communications challenge than it was a policy issue. This was a sensible policy. Home heating oil is more polluting. It's more expensive. It disproportionately affects lower income Canadians. And it's not just in Atlantic Canada. 40% of users are in Quebec. 20% are in the West. Like it's across the country. It affects homes across the country. Does it affect more homes in Atlantic Canada? Yes. But I think the problem was that it came out as an Atlantic Canada carve-out, and it didn't recognize that there was this distribution across the country, or certainly the communication failed to deliver that message. That was key. I do, however, think, and I said this last week, believe that every time you make a carve-out, you do make a concession, or you're seen to be making a concession. Jordan just made this point. I agree with it. When you take a plank that is the cornerstone, a key cornerstone plank of the election platform, which this government was first elected, and you start carving it out, even if it's sensible policy, it sends a message that this really is an affordability issue. And I agree, it does become a bit like a thread that you start to pull, and you're seeing that in the House, but where does it end? And so I do think that the government has put themselves a little bit in a corner on this one, and they have to now dig themselves out.
Yeah, Shachi, I mean, we're looking at the government's numbers and polls. Depending on which one you look at, it varies.
None of them are very good for this.
None of them are good.
Not at
like
the moment.
14, 15, 16 points down. I mean, you take your pick, but it looks bad. Double digits at least, we could probably say, based on the things that we've seen so far. Is there a way to turn this around? Like, is there something they can do on climate and affordability to try and pick up those numbers a little bit?
Both on the long-term existence and life of carbon pricing in this country and on this government's livability, its lifespan, and particularly of that of the Prime Minister. Look, they have brought in the priest to call last rites on Justin Trudeau before. It's happened before. He miraculously gets out of bed and gets up, and everybody says it's a political miracle, or at least the Liberals do. I've seen him down this far before. I've seen him come back up before. So much of this is tied to how bedeviled this government and this Prime Minister has been by the cost of living crisis. They have just been trying to run through wet cement on it. They've done very, very poorly in terms of being able to authentically communicate empathy, authentically communicate that they get what Canadians and people in those households are going through, what parents are going through, what seniors are going through. So if the cost of living crisis starts to dissipate, if we start to see interest rates coming down, the mortgage pressures, the rental pressures, all of those things that have been causing so many problems start to dissipate, that actually creates a massive relief valve for the Liberals. But more than that, it takes away from the Conservatives the one issue, the very only issue that has moved the needle for the Conservatives in 8 years. Okay, we've seen them tied, we've seen them up a little bit, down a little bit. We've never seen double-digit leads before. Now, some of that might be the fatigue factor with this government that you can't come back from, but a lot of it certainly has coincided with the beginning and the lifespan of this cost of living crisis. On carbon taxation and pricing, it's you can start to see different provinces agitating for different carve-outs and different things, and different people saying, well, I want this and I want that. It will be interesting to see what happens in British Columbia, which has had its own carbon program for a while, and Quebec. Both of those places are probably likely to stand by what they've had and can probably weather that storm politically. So then this really becomes about other provinces and what happens with them.
Tim, final word to you.
Yeah, I think it is a fool's errand to write off Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party. There's a reason they dominated the 20th century and are doing okay in the 21st century. However, I would say the time and tiredness is having an impact. If you look at some of our data, and Shachi's had some of this as well, the way the Liberals are looking at Justin Trudeau is very different than it was 8 years ago. And that's not surprising, but when they get to his, whether he's believable or they view him as inauthentic, and this is some of the stuff that we saw, including with 2021 Liberal voters, and they think he's inauthentic in the 90th percentile, that is not good. Yep. But 2 years is a very long time. Lots of other dynamics could come into play here. He is not dead. Maybe they're sprinkling the communion oil over him, but
Vigil is being prayed.
But he can rise again. Be careful.
Don't hand out the mass cards just yet. Is that what you're saying? Okay, thanks, guys. Thanks to the Power Panel. Shachi Kurl, Jordan Leichnitz, Tim Powers, and Amanda Alvaro. So good to see you guys. Thank you.